We are still in Judges, but we are still doing the Jephthah story and still on using the same handout that we had from Sunday. So I think there's some on the back table, the AV table. If you didn't get one Sunday or lost yours, it should say Class 6 and 7 if you're at home, or even if you're here, you want to use your device to check in on the website under Bible class material, Judges. You could find handout for Class 6 and 7 there. We were in the middle of talking about Jephthah, so what we want to do is just jump back in and do a little bit of recap. Hopefully you guys will help me with that, and then we will get into where we left off, which is probably the most interesting part of the Jephthah story, which involves his daughter. But this is chapters 10 to 12. And so this is where we are in the text, and the map here shows where some of these things take place. Judges is interesting. The geography of Judges is all over the map, literally. And one of the things that helps us to see, and we'll talk about some of this tonight as we wrap up the Jephthah story, but Judges is a very regional book. We think of the next phase of Israel's history after the Judges is what we call the United Kingdom. And oftentimes, I was thinking about this the other day, oftentimes we think of the United Kingdom in distinction to the divided kingdom when Israel goes to the north and Judah goes to the south. But we could also think of the period of the United Kingdom being distinct from the period of the Judges, because the period of the Judges is very regional. There hasn't really been anywhere so far in Judges and nowhere else in the book that we'll see a full unifying event for the nation of Israel. It's always just a couple of tribes here or a few tribes here that either get together and do something cooperatively, or, as we're starting to see more of, will have a conflict, butt heads, and even draw swords at certain points. And so these judges are popping up all over the map. And Othniel was down here in Judah. Ehud was here in Benjamin. We had Deborah, who was from Benjamin, but remember, Barak fought his battles up here using the forces of Naphtali and Zebulun. And then Jephthah here is in the land of Gilead, across the Jordan to the east. And so let's talk about what we've seen so far. I'll just ask you these questions surrounding a series of dialogues that we've had. So remember that in chapter 10, verse 6 to 16, Israel and God talked. They had a conversation. And we'll talk some about that in a minute. The elders and Jephthah have a conversation from chapters 10, verse 17 to chapter 11, verse 11. And then Jephthah and Ammon, that is the leaders of the nation of Ammon in chapter 11, also have a conversation, although it's fairly one-sided. So I'll ask you this. I think what I have next is notes. So I'll ask you some questions here. What was the conversation, in chapter 10, verse 6 to 16, what was the conversation like between Israel and God? How did that go? What's the situation in Israel in chapter 10, and what was the back and forth like between them and Jehovah? No microphones tonight. Shout it out. I'll repeat it. Yes, and I think maybe that's what I had. So we could say God in a way is more distant this time than what we've seen before. Albert's right. Israel is reflecting in chapter 10. They say in verse 10, we have sinned against you. We have forsaken our God and served the Baals. Remember that the text says back in verse 6 of chapter 10 that they had gone after all these different gods, more gods listed than what we've seen before. Baals, Ashtaroth, gods of Aram, Sidon, Moab, and even the gods of the sons of Ammon, gods of the Philistines, so on and so forth. Okay. But when they come to God, what does God tell them in chapter 10? Yeah, he says, you've got all these other gods, ask them to deliver you. So again, when we say distant, we could say that in both directions. the people have drifted farther from the Lord. When they do turn to him, God is not as responsive and, yes, I'll save you. And remember, we kind of went around and around about this phrase and what exactly it might mean. But in verse 16, what finally puts it over the edge is it says that God basically became impatient with their misery. So it's like he couldn't take it any longer, and then finally he just had to maybe step in and make something happen. Okay, speaking of what happens, the people are oppressed by Ammon, and so there's this conversation between the elders, again, not the elders of Israel, largely speaking, but the elders of Mizpah, really, in the region of Gilead, the elders of the city and Jephthah. And how does that conversation go? What are the elders requesting of Jephthah? Save us, right? Yeah, fight for us. And Jephthah's response is? Yeah, there's this negotiating going on. I'm going to hope that's the next one I have here. There's this negotiating going on, okay? Jephthah's smart. He realizes he has the leverage in the situation. So he says, okay, you want me to help you? Well, then you got to do something for me. And when this is all over, I'd be happy to be your head, happy to be your chief, depending on what your translation says. And the people, of course, are desperate, and they're happy to accept Jephthah's terms on that. Okay, and then what about the conversation between Jephthah and Ammon? What is the nature of the conflict between the people in Gilead and Ammon, and how does Jephthah address the situation? Remember, what is the conflict between Ammon and the people of Israel? It's land. Yeah, that's often the case in world history, right? But Ammon, I think I have a map next after this, but Ammon is to the east of the eastern portion of Israel beyond the Jordan, and they're always pressed for land, and so they have come into Gilead to claim land that they say belong to them. Jephthah's response is what? It's actually interesting. We want to note this about Jephthah, especially when we're tempted to pile on him too badly. What is Jephthah's response to Ammon's, threatening of taking the land of Israel? Yeah, Jephthah knows his history, and he says that land was never yours to begin with, and Jehovah God, gave that land. It was the land of the Amorites in the times of King Sihon and Og, that we read about in the book of Numbers. And Jehovah God gave it to the Israelites, so you as the Ammonites don't have a claim on that. By the way, it's been 300 years. You've never said anything about it. And so he ends that in verse 27 by saying, I have not sinned against you, but you are doing wrong by making war against me. May the Lord, the judge today between the sons of Israel and the sons of Ammon. But, verse 28, the king of the sons of Ammon disregarded the message which Jephthah sent him. I think we should note here that this response or this message that Jephthah sends here, I don't think it was really intended to make peace. I think you read that last statement, verse 27. This is not a conciliatory message. This is a challenging message. Now, I think we would say Jephthah's in the right in what he has said. He, again, is remembering his history well. But it does not appear that he is saying this to say, hey, come on, telling you the facts here, let's just settle this peacefully. He's going through the history to say, okay, you really want to go? Let's go. We have rightful claim to this land. God's going to decide it, and by that he means when our armies meet in the battlefield, then we'll see who really deserves possession of this land. And so you see, not only with Ammon, even going back to how he dealt with the elders, the words of Jephthah, that's going to be a theme here. I think I mentioned that on Sunday. The words of Jephthah, using his words to manipulate, to get his way, to get what he wants. And I think that will maybe set the stage well for the next story also. Okay, so here's where all this is taking place. Here's Ammon to the east of the Jordan. Here's the Jordan River. And so Gilead is the land that belongs to Israel east of the Jordan. Ammon is right here, and we talked about this. Remember, they're pressed up against really wilderness. And so if they want to increase their territory, this is where they go. And so the conflict is going to take place right here in Gilead. All right, let's keep going here. And it's interesting, and I think we should pay attention to the way the story's told. Judges 11, 27, 28, we just read that, is a kind of a build-up to what we would think of as, these are fighting words, a battle's about to take place. But notice the way the story's told, the climax, the real tension as the story progresses is not the battle. The battle actually takes up very few words. It's what happens surrounding the battle involving Jephthah and his daughter that really creates the tension, the conflict in the story that has to be resolved in a tragic way. So think about this as we read this part of Jephthah's story. What is Jephthah doing? What is he saying when he makes the vow? What does he mean by it? Why does he do it? Hopefully we can talk some about that. How does he view the vow, especially after it has been made and after it has been completed? And then how does his daughter view the vow? And this is kind of the classic question of the Jephthah story. Does he go through with it and fulfill the vow in the way that he said he would? So let's read Judges 11, 29 to 40. Now the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, so that he passed through Gilead and Manasseh. Then he passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he went on to the sons of Ammon. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, "If you will indeed give the sons of Ammon into my hand, then it shall be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the sons of Ammon, it shall be the Lord's. I will offer it up as a burnt offering." So Jephthah crossed over to the sons of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. He struck them with a very great slaughter, from Aroer to the entrance of Minnith, 20 cities, and as far as Abel Keramim. So the sons of Ammon were subdued before the sons of Israel. Verse 34, when Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah, behold, his daughter was coming out to meet him with tambourines and with dancing. Now she was his one and only child. Besides her, he had no son or daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me, for I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot take it back." So she said to him, "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you have said, since the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the sons of Ammon." She said to her father, "Let this thing be done for me. Let me alone 2 months, that I may go to the mountains and weep because of my virginity, I and my companions." Then he said, "Go." So he sent her away for 2 months, and she left with her companions and wept on the mountains because of her virginity. At the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did to her according to the vow which he had made, and she had no relations with a man. Thus it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year. Okay, what is Jephthah doing? What is he saying? Why does he say it? I like the silence. The silence is nice. I taught the Zoom class Monday. It was the first time I'd done that. And it was kind of nice because I could ask a question then mute myself. It was like demonstrating to everybody else, I am not going to say anything. That'd be great to do that up here. Just ask a question and then just say, mute. You have to talk. Okay, Dan says, he asked the Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever the first one to come out of my house, I will give as a sacrifice. What do we think Jephthah had in mind? So the one possibility is that he was thinking of an animal. Okay, maybe we can talk about that in a little bit. Anybody have a different idea about that? I guess we would just kind of get on the table. What would be the other possibility? Yeah, that he had in mind a servant or a person, okay? And so those are our two possibilities. I'll give you some things to think about in a second. But that's what he says. So with that interpretive question, animal, man, whatever he had in his mind, why is he making this vow? What is his purpose in doing this and making this vow? What is he trying to accomplish? What's his game, we might say? So Lucille says he's bargaining with God. Anybody thinking a similar thing, or want to maybe you want to elaborate that, if somebody else wants to elaborate on that idea? What do we mean he's maybe bargaining with God? Yeah, Dan says he's making a deal. Okay, you do this for me, I'll do this for you. What's a little? Well, let me back up. Does that fit? And I admit I'm leading. This is too much of a lead-on question here. That fits with what we've seen about Jephthah. Maybe you see the story in context. I mean, Jephthah's kind of always been about making deals. Okay, make a deal with the Gileadites. Okay, not so much making a deal with the Ammonites, but clearly. He's, again, a negotiator of some sort, okay? Now, let's step back a little bit. What's a little bit sad or maybe even ironic about Jephthah feeling like he has to make a deal with God in order for this to happen? Yeah, Dan says that he should have had faith, or at least he could have had faith for God to do it anyway. And we could even go to the text here and say, what is it? Well, maybe Albert's going to say something else, but I could say, what has the text already told us about the Lord's involvement? Albert, maybe you were going to say something else. Yeah. I'm trying to think what I have up here. Don't want to give too much away. So Albert mentioned this phrase, the Spirit of the Lord. And again, we saw it with Gideon. We saw it with Othniel. And it made sense with Othniel. There was probably no problem with that because everything kind of seemed, on the up and up. With Gideon, at that point in the story, in chapter 6 of the Gideon story, it didn't bother us too much. Gideon seemed like a stand-up guy, maybe a little bit reluctant, but humble, trusting in God's power. God was, to Albert's point, God had communicated with, Gideon and God were having just a constant back and forth. Visions and angels and talking and asking questions and asking for signs. And so God and Gideon had this thing going back and forth. So it doesn't surprise us to say the Spirit of the Lord, came upon Gideon and empowered him to do God's work. With Jephthah, it's not as easy. I think we'd have more problem with this idea that the Spirit of the Lord empowered him. Albert mentions communication. Maybe we would say we're not told, so we can't say one way or the other. But there at least is nothing in the text that indicates that Jephthah was having any kind of conversation with the Lord. Nowhere does it say he inquired of the Lord or even that God spoke to him. And I think just the way that this phrase is used throughout the Old Testament, that the Spirit of the Lord came upon this person, that person, it doesn't always seem, or maybe most of the time, doesn't seem like a very obvious thing to the observer, okay? I guess maybe if you're, tying 500 foxes' tails together and lighting them on fire, it would be like, I don't think he could have done that on his own, But you know what I'm saying? It doesn't have to be the case that God explicitly came to Jephthah and said, Jephthah, I am Jehovah. My Spirit is now coming upon you, and you know that it is, okay? I think we read chapter 11, verse 29, and it's a kind of a behind-the-scenes statement to say that the reader should know God is the one empowering Jephthah, but Jephthah may not have been aware of that. And in fact, I would say that his deal-making, his bargaining with God, may be an indication, to Dan's point, that he didn't understand that God was working through him, that he didn't have the faith to say, I'm an instrument of God, God's going to work through me to accomplish the victory. Instead, he felt the need to, again, use his words to make a deal with God and get what he wanted. Okay, I'm happy for someone to take the opposite side and provide maybe a counter argument. Oh, John even grabbing the microphone. Somehow I knew John was going to be the one to stand up for Jephthah. So,
well, actually, I'm going to get this. I actually have a proxy comment from Robert McDonald in Missouri.
Oh, cool.
His argument would be that Jephthah did know maybe that God was working through him, and this was a way of providing thanks ahead of time. You're going to deliver us, and maybe the offering was sacrificial in nature. Robert always seems to take the side of these judges, and I
appreciate
that.
But the fact that he's not here, this is a perfect segue into my next point. Consider this. You can think what you want, but there is evidence in the text to suggest that Jephthah was not thinking about a goat or a lamb or some kind of animal that he was going to sacrifice. That he did have in his mind a human sacrifice on this instance. Okay, so let's just look at some of this here. Verse 31. The text says there's two things I'll point out. One is that it says, the New American Standard says, "It shall be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house." Okay. Actually, maybe there's more than two things. First thing would be that word "whatever." It's a little bit ambiguous, but most of the time is more of a whoever than a whatever. Okay. It's more likely that refers to a who than a what. Okay, a person rather than an animal or a thing. Okay. Also, come out of the doors of my house to meet me. Okay, so that's there's two separate things there. One, I don't know if we're thinking an animal is coming out of the doors of the house. Okay, animals are probably other places. Okay, I can't say I claim to know how it all works back then, but I would imagine coming out of the house, again, probably more so thinking of a person than an animal, and coming out of the doors of my house to meet me, right? Maybe Fluffy the goat was just a wonderful family pet that he was just going to be so happy to see Jephthah coming home that he was going to run out and do what goats do when they see their owners. But again, I think if you take that phrase at face value, especially if you take a whoever as opposed to a whatever, Jephthah has a person in mind. And we would say, what? Is it possible that an Israelite could ever say that he's going to offer a human sacrifice is the most detestable thing to God? What might be our response to that? You don't have to think like I do, but let's say you're on the side of, Jephthah was going to do a human sacrifice. That's what he thought from the beginning. And then your opponent said, no, Israelites would never do that. What would the response be to that objection? Yeah. Have you been reading Judges? Did you read Judges chapter 10, verse 6? All the different gods that they were worshiping. Have you seen how off track they've gotten? Another interesting thing, back in verse, where is that? Verse 24, I thought it was. Yeah, verse 24. In Jephthah's argument to the Ammonites, he says, do you not possess the land which Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess? It's a little bit complicated. Chemosh is historically the god of the Moabites, okay? So there's something weird going on where maybe the Ammonites have adopted Moabite gods. But the Ammonite god, which it mentioned back in chapter 10, was one of the gods that Israel served. The Ammonite god was Malcolm or Macom or whatever. Also translated other places in the Old Testament, Molech, which we know that Molech was a god that the Israelites offered child sacrifices at least to, okay? So my point is this. Human sacrifice was fairly ordinary among the gods of the other peoples that were around Israel. And so if we already know that in the time of the judges, the people were conforming to the ways of the peoples around them more than to the ways of the covenant they had with Jehovah, then maybe we wouldn't be as shocked or surprised if Jephthah really did have in mind that he's going to offer a person. Okay. Now, did he think it was his daughter? Maybe not. Okay. But I mean, even if that was a possibility, how many of us have said something beforehand to say, oh yeah, like if this happens, I'll do this. And then once it all plays out, you realize, uh-oh, I shouldn't have said what I said. Okay, I got a little bit too overconfident. Okay. Notice the reaction, and maybe I should ask you about this first. The reaction is also interesting. And I'll just read it, and you can tell me what you think. When she comes out, the daughter comes out to meet Jephthah. This is his response in verse 35. Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me, for I have given my word to the Lord. I cannot take it back. How do you read that reaction? Okay. That wouldn't be surprising, right? Tore his clothes. It was not happy. Only daughter, only child, in fact, which may be part of what's going on here as well. Yeah. Yeah, and you could even, maybe especially because of the high of winning the victory, we've maybe had those moments where you're so high, and then, when the tragedy strikes, it's like even worse of a blow because of how high you were. Is anybody else like me to think that that's kind of a self-focused reaction? Maybe I'm making it up. Maybe I'm trying too hard to see. Robert's probably going to correct me in the comment section here, which will be fine. But there's something about, you have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me. And I'm thinking, okay, someone is troubling the other here, but it seems like Jephthah's the one, troubling his daughter that he's about to, offer as a burnt offering. But maybe that's just, not. Maybe he is just expressing his grief. Anybody with me on this, or am I crazy? Okay, at least I have Dan, so that's good. Albert, I don't have Albert, but... Yeah. What did you say? That Granny's right. We want to avoid what is it? Is it Paul talks about endless speculations or endless? These aren't genealogies, but they are maybe speculations to some degree. Okay. There's also a question. I don't know if you guys have heard this before. There's also a question about whether Jephthah actually went through with the burnt offering. Do you guys know? Are you guys familiar with this at all? Do you know what the other possibility is that people have said? Yeah, it's kind of like a vow, and people read this, because she mourns her virginity and she goes into the hills to mourn with her friends for a while, and then it talks about the Israelite women commemorating this tragedy by mourning. Again, and it focuses on the fact that she was unmarried. Some have speculated that like she became a nun or something. It's a little bit too trivial, but that she took a vow and she was offered up in that way to go live a life of solitude or celibacy, and that was his way of fulfilling the offering. Okay. So Dan's on that theory. Okay. Any other takers on that theory? I think he went through with it, and then there'd be a whole other conversation. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Should he have gone through with it? I'm that. Not as concerned with that necessarily, but I do think, the language that's used is the language of burnt offering, and so to say that he did according to the vow would mean that he went through with the burnt offering. Yeah, he was held to it. Yeah, Ecclesiastes says something about not thinking through a vow that you're going to make. But let me say this, and if there are other comments, I'm happy to hear them. I do want to try to emphasize this in the context of the Jephthah story. We often talk about Jephthah's rashness as being his problem. He was rash. He spoke too quickly. I think that's part of it. But I want to suggest to you that in the context of the story, maybe we should focus more on this characteristic of Jephthah in trying to use his words to get his way. He's self-interested. He's a negotiator. He's trying to make deals for things to turn out better for himself. And we see that all in the story leading up to this point where that gets him in trouble. And maybe you'd say, yeah, well, he's also rash if he had thought through before he said this. And fair enough. But I want us to see Jephthah's kind of character, more largely speaking, as being self-focused, self-interested, getting his way, getting what he can out of a situation. Opportunist, I think, was that the word you used earlier, Albert? I think we can see that in Jephthah as well. Okay, I'm not going to say any more about this, but I'm happy for you guys to make comments so that you can have the last word on Jephthah and his daughter. Yes, Shannon. Yeah, Shannon says if God's trying to teach him a lesson, then however tragic this is, you can see how this would have taught Jephthah a lesson. Because as Shannon points out, God knew how this was going to play out. So just to repeat for those that weren't able to hear, Albert says this is causing him to reflect on his commitment to the Lord and committing to that even when it's not easy, but also thinking about Jephthah's tendency to seek after worldly things, and then, our tendency to do that, and then after a while look back and see that we have sacrificed things that we shouldn't have sacrificed along the way in pursuit of the things that we thought we wanted so desperately. So, John, you got something?
Yeah, we're getting some comments in online, but I think Steve was pointing out what we'd all acknowledge, that he's in Hebrews 11 as a hero of faith. And so there was something here, whether he was bargaining or throwing out a sacrifice of thanks, that there was enough faith there to follow through with this battle and have a victory, however unfortunate the sacrifices were. And, we can regret, Robert's pointing out that we can regret what we promised. And that's a lesson that whatever side, and I'm adding some color here, but I think that's a lesson that whatever side of this discussion we fall down, is what we say has consequences, and that's as applicable to us today as any lesson in Judges.
Cool. Well, I made my commitment. I vowed that I was going to let you guys have the last word. So here I am, fulfilling my vow. Not going to say any more about it. Okay, let's finish off the Jephthah story and move on to chapter 12. And let's just read the whole thing. And we're going to end the Jephthah story with another conflict, intertribal conflict. So that's really what we want to focus on, pay attention to. And then we do get, at the end of this chapter, the three judges quickly given, minor judges after Jephthah. So just notice who they are and what is said about them. Judges chapter 12, let's read the whole thing. Then the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they crossed to Zaphon and said to Jephthah, "Why did you cross over and fight against the sons of Ammon without calling us to go with you? We will burn your house down on you." Jephthah said to them, "I and my people were at great strife with the sons of Ammon. When I called you, you did not deliver me from their hand. When I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hands and crossed over against the sons of Ammon, and the Lord gave them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me?" Then Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought Ephraim. And the men of Gilead defeated Ephraim because they said, "You are fugitives, O Ephraim, O Gileadites, in the midst of Ephraim and in the midst of Manasseh." The Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan opposite Ephraim. And it happened when any of the fugitives of Ephraim said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead would say to him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he would say no, they would say to him, "Say now, Shibboleth." But he said, "Sibboleth," for he could not pronounce it correctly. Then he seized him and slew him at the fords of the Jordan. Thus there fell at that time 42,000 of Ephraim. Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in one of the cities of Gilead. Verse 8, now Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel after him. He had 30 sons, 30 daughters whom he gave in marriage outside the family, and he brought in 30 daughters from outside for his sons. He judged Israel 7 years, and Ibzan died and was buried in Bethlehem. Now Elon the Zebulunite judged Israel after him, and he judged Israel 10 years. Then Elon the Zebulunite died and was buried at Aijalon in the land of Zebulun. Now Abdon the son of Hillel the Pirathonite judged Israel after him. He had 40 sons, 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys, and he judged Israel 8 years. Then Abdon the son of Hillel the Pirathonite died and was buried at Pirathon in the land of Ephraim, in the hill country of the Amalekites. Okay, what's the conflict between Ephraim and Jephthah, really? Again, what we have here is now a 5th episode where there is a dialogue between Jephthah and Ephraim. And what's the deal here? So Albert, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. So Albert says, because the enemy was not close to Ephraim and Jephthah took care of them, it's possible that they're worried about being vulnerable now, that enemies could come and attack them. Is that? I just want to make sure I'm understanding you, right? Oh, well, here you go. Equal opportunity here. So, Jephthah's from Mizpah around here. Remember, he grows up in Tob, and he comes back through. And it talks about him going through Manasseh, which is probably eastern Manasseh, probably to round up people, and then he fights with the Ammonites here. Ephraim's on the other side of the Jordan here. Other ideas about what maybe is the source of the conflict here? Perhaps Ephraim feels threatened now or vulnerable to some degree. Could be some tribal land disputes with, in close proximity here. Yeah, it hasn't gone well before when judges, amassed power, as John points out in the case of Gideon. I'm pretty sure Ephraim did help. That would be in chapter 5, but maybe they're not even mentioned. Ephraim came down, chapter 5, verse 14. And we call this a trope in literature. It just keeps happening. In 5:14, it says Ephraim did come down to help Barak. Remember in chapter 8, verse 1, Ephraim is upset with Gideon for not inviting them along for the battle. And Gideon is able to wiggle out of that one by saying, hey, you had the 2 leaders of Midian come into your backyard and you got to kill them. So isn't that better than anything we got to do? And they're like, oh yeah, you're right. So they're appeased there. This time around, I think it is the case that the Ephraimites are upset that they were not involved in the battle. Okay, maybe it seems kind of silly to us, but in a culture of honor, okay, especially military honor, and Ephraim seems, again, I think I mentioned this, Ephraim really all throughout Israel's history is kind of like the head tribe of the northern tribes. Okay, they have a lot of power, a lot of influence, and a lot of military might, and so they would maybe feel like they were passed over or dishonored by not being invited to be part of the battle. And Jephthah seems to be saying, this was a Gilead thing, okay? The Ammonites weren't attacking you, they were attacking us, and you never came over to help us when we were being attacked by the Ammonites, so I didn't invite you. But what happens as a result of this conflict? It seems like your pride is wounded, right? Maybe 2 pistols at 32 paces could settle it, okay? But what ends up happening? They go to battle. I mean, this is crazy. So, again, we're supposed to, whenever you watch a movie, watch a TV series, when there's the same setting, that it's the one location that keeps popping up throughout the TV series or throughout the movie, there's themes that are being, worked and developed here. In 328, it is at the fords of the Jordan where the men in following Ehud slay the Moabites who are fleeing to their homeland. It is at the fords of the Jordan in chapter 7, verse 24, that the Ephraimites stop and catch the Midianites who are fleeing and slaughter them at the fords of the Jordan. Now, at the very place where the Israelites had habitually slaughtered their enemies, 42,000 Israelites die at the hand of their own brothers. And Jephthah and his men kill tens of thousands of Ephraimites there at the fords of the Jordan. Okay, and it's amazing. You got the whole shibboleth thing, right? Something about the way the Ephraimites talk. They couldn't pronounce this word properly, so it was a way to give them away, so they would know who to kill and who not to kill. Okay, like a lisp or something like that. But because they can't say the word, they were slaughtered there, and again, 42,000 of them died. We won't say a whole lot about it, but you read the description of Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, especially, Ibzan has his 30 sons. He gives them away to, marry 30 daughters outside of his family. He brings in 30 daughters for his son. So, there's this kind of giving and taking of marriage, like a king would do. Abdon and got to get it right, 40 sons and 30 grandsons and the 70 donkeys. I mean, you see it, even though we know nothing about these no-name judges, the little we have seems to be a picture of pomp, pride, exaltation to some degree. Again, not to make too much of it, but it is interesting that those are the details that were given. Okay, out of time basically, but I just want to run through some of the highlights of the Jephthah story. And then Sunday and Wednesday, John's going to teach on Samson, while Beth and I and Asher and Summer are visiting family in Georgia. So, think about the Jephthah story and this picture of decline that we've been seeing in the Judges. We saw in Gideon's story, Jehovah's response was harsher than it had been before. Now in the Jephthah story, Jehovah's response is even harsher than it was to Gideon. For Gideon, it was, hey, you guys disobeyed me. And there was nothing else said. In the case of the Jephthah story, he says, hey, go to these other gods. Let them deliver you. I'm not going to deliver you anymore. The people, and also Israel serving more gods than they had before. Remember, it's the people that choose Jephthah. So there is a departure from the pattern. Instead of the Lord raised up Ehud, the Lord raised up, Deborah and Barak, or Deborah was a prophetess or whatever. Or even in Gideon, an angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon. Gideon, God's called you to be a mighty warrior. Here, God is obviously working behind the scenes, but it says it's the people that go and seek out Jephthah. And Jephthah is, as we've belabored, self-interested. He has this maybe twisted notion of God. And so he's different than the other judges that we've seen. Tribal conflict this time around, it leads to civil war, basically, and tens of thousands dead. The word king is not mentioned, but you do see with Jephthah and his successors this idea of amassing more power, displaying that power like a king might, and that's not viewed as a good thing. And yet, this gets to the point that, as Steve mentioned and John commented on, it's brought up a lot in Judges, but they're in Hebrews 11. And, I think we want to notice that the Hebrews writer is doing something special with those names. So we want to leave him to his purposes. the Judges writer clearly has a purpose in telling his story. And I think his purpose is to show the darkness, the depravity in the time of the Judges, and also to show that God uses unlikely deliverers to accomplish his purposes. That God, in spite of the evil, in spite of the chaos, is working to deliver his people, and he doesn't do it in the way that you would expect. He uses people like Ehud, even people like Gideon and Barak, even people like Jephthah, even people, as hard as it is to stomach, as y'all will talk about over the next few classes, even people like Samson can be used by God. Okay, and some of that plays into the goals that we've talked about. We'll end with this. We want to avoid that destructive cycle of sin. We want to think about that negative example, how to avoid that, how we can build trust, and see in all of these unlikely and oftentimes selfish and sinful deliverers that we need a king like Jesus who will, in the best way, stick to his word, make the sacrifice necessary to deliver his people. Okay, so that's Jephthah, and like I said, starting on Sunday, chapter 13, and the Samson story. Thank you, guys. We'll see you next year.